Literature Festival. We are here at the Bar Hall. Before we begin the session, the fog, the smog, and the flu, I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to our founding fathers who created one of the most brilliant documents of the 20th century, the Constitution of India, and ensured adult franchise for all. Fog, the smog, and the flu. Please welcome Christine Courtin, Laura Spinney, Siddharth Singh in conversation with David Olusoga. Can we please give them a big round of applause?
Thank you very much. Is the mic working? Can everyone hear me? That's wonderful, great. Well, it's great to be here, and it's great to be here with such a wonderful panel. We're here to talk about three very different health crises, two historical and one very much contemporary. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to tell us about their work in about 10 minutes, and then we'll have discussions, and then we'll open up the floor and have discussions and questions with you. I'm going to ask Laura Spinney to go first, but I think I want to introduce the panel before anyone speaks. So Laura, who's in the middle, is a British scientist, a science journalist, but she's also the writer of both fiction and non-fiction books, and she's here today to talk about her most recent book, Pale Rider, the Spanish Flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World. Christine Courtin is a senior member of Wolfson College, Cambridge, and a freelance writer, and she's here today to talk about her book, London Fog, the Biography. And Siddharth Singh is an energy and mobility and climate policy expert. He's been working with various energy research institutions for the past 9 years. He's a graduate of SOAS and of the University of Delhi, and he's with us today to talk about his book, The Great Smog of India. So, Laura, if I could ask you to go first, as I said, to tell us about the flu pandemic of 1918 and how it did change the world.
Hello, everybody. Well, I thought I would just kick us off perhaps with some reflections on mass death, which is essentially what we're all talking about, and our attitude to it. But I just wanted to start with the story of how I wrote this book. So I'm a science journalist, as David said, and around 2013, 14, a lot of the editors who I work for were starting to think about how we might mark the centenary of the First World War. Coming up obviously 2014 to 2018. And so we were wondering how we might do this in scientific ways and coming up with ideas. And I was sent to the Italian Alps to write a story about archaeologists who were digging, for want of a better word, in ice fields higher than 3,000 meters, where a little-known chapter of the First World War called the White War was fought for that border between Austria and Italy. It was a miserable war, but what's interesting is that the remains of those battlefields and the soldiers were melted into the ice, which is a very good preserver, and now the remains of those battlefields are coming out as the glaciers melt. So it turned out to be an extremely moving trip for me because while I was there, the remains of two young Austrian soldiers essentially melted out of the ice in a very good condition, and we had their funeral in one of the highest villages in the Italian Alps. So we had essentially what must have been one of the last, if not the last, funerals for the First World War. And I came home and I said to my husband, that was incredibly moving, and if we've got 4 years ahead of us of the science of the Great War, I'm not sure I can take it. And he thought for a moment and he said to me, you know, we never talk about the Spanish flu. And we're also about to mark the centenary of that. Why is that? And I thought, he's right. And I did my first Google search, and I saw some of the numbers that float around the Spanish flu. And I was completely staggered by this. And I thought, why aren't we talking about this as well? The Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920 killed an estimated 50 million people, minimum, perhaps the double of that. To put those numbers in perspective, the First World War killed around 18 million people, and the Second World War, 50 to 60 million people. AIDS has killed 35 million people, and fog and smog kill millions of people, or 1 million people a year, as Siddharth will explain later. So why is that? Why do we, you know, we talk in 1918 about the First World War. We are obsessed by Nazism and the Second World War, and we glorify, in some sense, mass death that is brought about by war. And we don't talk about these other kinds of death, which, in fact, are a greater threat to us today. Wars of the kind of the First World War and the Second World War are unlikely to happen again. War itself will continue, of course, but I suspect it'll be of a different form. But pandemics are as much of a threat as ever. The global population is growing very fast, and so they are an enormous threat to us. Air pollution, climate change, these also are huge threats to us, and yet we don't think about them. I myself had not thought about the Spanish flu until I had that conversation with my husband, and I had never really written about infectious diseases before. My intention with this book was to try and fill a hole in our memory. So I think that's something we should reflect upon, and there are lots of interesting reasons for that perhaps we can come to in the discussion. But just to give you a few facts, so the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu, infected 1 in 3 people on Earth, or 500 million people. As I say, it killed between 50 and 100 million of them, so it was an incredibly lethal flu pandemic amongst the flu pandemics we've had. Of those dead, 18 million Indians died. India was the country that had the largest loss of life in absolute numbers of any country in the world. So the flu struck in 3 waves. There was a mild initial wave in the Northern Hemisphere spring of 1918, a much more lethal second wave the following autumn, and then a third wave in the early months of 1919 that was intermediate in severity between the other 2. It had a very interesting age range, so it attacked the very young and the very old, as all flus do, whether pandemic or seasonal, but it also attacked a middle-age group of the 20 to 40-year-olds. So it wiped out the pillars of communities and the producers in families, which I think is what was so tragic about it. And for me, that tragedy is distilled in a painting, the last painting by the Austrian painter Egon Schiele, who his wife Edith was 6 months pregnant when she died of the Spanish flu in the autumn of 1918. He died 3 days later, having painted this painting called The Family of the 3 of them, nude with a newborn, in the interim. And then he died at the age of 29, which was in fact the peak age of death in that middle age group, and leaving this painting behind of a family that would never exist. So for me, that painting distills the tragedy of the Spanish flu. We have talked quite a lot about this pandemic in the last year because of the centenary. Whether we'll continue to talk about it after the centenary has passed, I don't know. I would like to put in a bid for the fact that we do, because the fact that we are going to have another flu pandemic is a fact, it is a certainty. We cannot predict today where it will happen or how severe it will be. But the World Bank put out an estimate a few years ago suggesting that if a flu strain as dangerous as the one that caused that pandemic in 1918 were to emerge in the future, it would kill 33 million people in the first 6 months and wipe 5% off GDP, global GDP, so triggering a major recession. So these are some of the reasons perhaps why we should think about the past, think about what are the major risks to our health and to our lives, and put more effort, money, and thought into pandemic preparedness for the future.
Laura, thank you very much. Christine, could you tell us, give us 10 minutes on your book, The London Fog?
Yes, I certainly can. Can you all hear me? And I'd like to thank Jaipur Literature Festival for inviting me, and we've just spent the last 2 weeks going through India, and we've absolutely loved it. We should have some pictures. Are they going to come? Yep. Right, next, and I have to keep saying next. Right, this is what London fog looks like. Now, London actually has a natural fog problem. It's in a basin, it's got a river running through it, it's got lots of marshland around it, so it has a natural white fog. But of course, with the increase of industrialization, the use of coal, it mixed with this fog to become this yellow, mainly yellow from the sulfur of the coal, but black, green mixture, a mixture where you literally literally could not see your hand in front of your face. And here you see an early print of life in London in the fog. It's chaos, it's confusion. Those people carrying lights are known as link lighters, and they would ferry you around London for a fee, although they may actually be criminal gangs who might then lead you down to an even darker alleyway and cosh you on the head and take all your money. But you can see that the carriage is coming, it has no idea where it's going, and people are literally getting lost in the fog. The next one, please. A later one, again the same chaos, confusion. You can actually see that someone in the corner, the right-hand corner, is actually having his watch stolen. And again, the link lighters who look rather older. Next, please. A German visitor, many visitors to London were absolutely appalled by the fog, and you can see here a quote where it says, "The winter fogs of London are indeed awful, and they surpass all imagining." And people felt that this actually created a kind of a low humour in the English. It was why they were so grumpy, so miserable, because of the fog. Next, please. What do you call it? What do you call this fog? I mean, we've got a natural fog, so we call that fog. What do Londoners call it? Well, you can see here, this is a very early print of London Particular, which was one of the names for it. London Particular was a Madeira wine specially imported to London, so it was very specific to London. And of course, it is the name that's used in Dickens's Bleak House when Guppy, describes the fog as a London Particular, but it's not a Dickensian term. It predates him. And you can see that this figure has a yellow handkerchief over his mouth, which indicates disease. It indicates the dirt of the fog. Next, please. Another term for it is London ivy, but an even more popular term was pea souper, which is not a green pea soup, it's a yellow pea soup, because the yellow pea soup was very much the kind of cheaper form of sustenance. It was used in the Irish famine. It's the yellow bean rather than the green, and here you can see it comes together with a London Particular soup, and in the background is an illustration from Bleak House. Next, please. These were the conditions. Traffic, could not get around. People had to lead cars. Next. And buses literally could not see where they were going. Next. Railways were affected. Quite often railways would stop before they got into the station, and people, this is before the era of health and safety where you could actually open the door of the train. You would open the door thinking that you'd got into the station, you'd fall out of the train onto a siding and might get hit by another train coming through. So it's not only the kind of the air that's actually you're breathing into your lungs, it's actually the other accidents that are involved with not being able to see where you were going. Next, please. This is actually just a little jokey one, a cab going round and round, which is the way to Paddington, I think it says, and the link lighter, a rather elderly link lighter, said, it's that way, I've told you that 3 times already. Next. Here we actually have, a qualified guide. I think it's the one where he's asking the way to the river, and the dripping man says, it's just over that way, I've just come from it. And in fact, although we can laugh about it, before the Thames was actually before it actually had, kind of fences up to stop you from walking into it, many people actually walked into the river and drowned. In fact, there's a 1870 story of 3 tanners who have just been paid. They've had a bit to drink. They're playing leapfrog in the fog, and they leapfrog into the river, and 2 of them are never seen again. Next, please. It affected animals. I could talk about London Zoo. White polar bears would try and pick at the particulates from the sooty bits and literally kind of take all the particulates into their lungs and couldn't cope with them. Whereas this one is a cow from the Smithfield Cattle Show in '52, which was a particularly bad fog. The cattle were affected by the fog, and in fact in the earliest Smithfield Cattle Show in 1873, over 90 heads of cattle were killed. In this picture, which seems to have disappeared, the cow has got a mask on it, which has been soaked in whiskey to try and disinfect the air. But you can imagine with 90 cows, prize cattle, killed during the fog of 1873, there were causes to what it was doing to people. And in fact, the 1952 smog probably killed about 12,000 people, although they only claimed 4,000 at the time. Next, please. Next. I can't see it. Sorry? I can't see the pictures. I can't see through the haze. No, no. Where's the next? Oh, right. Here it affected sports. This is a very famous football match, which was played just after the war. Moscow Dynamo were asked to come over and play, but they refused to play unless they could play Arsenal. So here they are. They're playing Arsenal on a particularly foggy day. The goalkeeper has no chance of actually seeing the ball coming towards him. And in fact, it was rumoured the Russians actually played 12 players, but of course we can't know. But in fact, the Moscow Dynamo won 4-3, so we'll just have to give that one to them. Next, please. Here, it upset the balance of power. So, of course, in the fog, everyone is equal. So here we've actually got this bewhiskered man who's obviously very wealthy, part of the elite, but in fact, he's being kind of cornered by these two link lighters who say, give us your money or we'll singe your whiskers. Next, please. Here we've got another link lighter. I'm the monarch of all I survey. Well, of course, he can survey very little, so it's rather ironic. Next. Again, pictures of people looking very worried, anxious in the fog, being led by a rather cocky link lighter, and with the wife kind of pulling her poor husband by the scarf. Next, please. A new form of link lighter, electricity. You know, obviously, as these new forms of energy came in, gas, electricity would replace coal, but people were very resistant to it. They loved their coal fire. So in 1948, George Orwell wrote in the Standard, why are these coal abaters, why are these smoke abaters trying to stop us from having our coal fire? We love it. Next, please. Here we got, again, there was a link between fog and alcohol. People living in this darkness, what was their resort? To the pub, where there were bright lights, there was lots of warmth and energy. So this one is basically Sari Gamp, you know, going to the pub to find, and Sari Gamp is a Dickensian figure. And of course, there's a lot of correlation between the fog and Dickens. Carry on. Right, fog glasses. There's a woman wearing fog glasses. Punch takes it a bit further and puts the fog glasses on horses. I don't think they worked. Next, please. The other attempt to kind of try to stop the fog from affecting you was smog masks, which we can talk about later. Next. Another attempt to try and disperse the fog was this design to actually shoot a cannonball into the fog and try and disperse it. It was never built, but I think it's a rather lovely picture. Carry on. Smoke inspectors. The testing of smoke was standardized in 1914, whereas before they had a test which was the Ringelmann test, which went from kind of light brown to black. The smoke inspectors put it up by a factory chimney and measure how black the smoke was. And if it was too black, they would try and stop the factory from working. But of course, that was very haphazard and based on one's own view of colours. Next. Art. This is an artist's studio. Of course, many British artists, English artists, found it very difficult to live in this darkened environment. Many of them went over to the Mediterranean to paint in the clear blue skies. This model, you know, is obviously looking very unhappy. Lots of suicides during the fog. The suicide rate went up massively. Next, please. But Turner here paints the fog, and you can see this yellow arc of fog, again indicating disease. This picture is beautiful, don't you agree? He couldn't sell it. No one was interested in buying pictures of fog. In fact, of course, all the buyers, the new industrialists, did not want to buy paintings that actually displayed what their industries were doing to the environment. Next. So that's the foreign view of fog. You know, the Frenchman coming over saying, I can see why you say the sun never sets on your empire. It never rises. And next, please. Yes, this is Whistler, an American artist who came over to paint London fog. Again, do you think it's beautiful? He couldn't sell it. It lay in his studio until he died. But I think it's wonderful with the lights kind of showing through. Next. The one who really kind of popularised London fog in art was Monet. And at this time, and I could give you another half-an-hour talk on Monet, but he came over in the 1890s, early 1900s. And of course, at that time, he was so popular, he could have painted anything. And he created over 100 canvases. He started them. He would go back to them. He was one of the few people who was actually upset if it wasn't a foggy day. Next. And we now have 35. There's another version. Next. And you know, Monet saying, I adore London, it's a mass, but what I most love is its fog. Probably one of the few. Next. Another Monet, you can see he keeps very much this kind of view of the bridge along the divider as the dividing line horizontally with, you know, the fog being reflected in the waters of the Thames. As I say, I could do more on Monet, but next, please. Another visitor to London, Yoshio Marquinho, a Japanese artist who actually went to San Francisco first to paint the San Francisco mist, was disappointed by their mist, so came to London and actually stayed in London for 20 years, only actually was forcibly removed during World War II. But he painted these beautiful, beautiful pictures of life in London fog. Carry on. Here's an up-to-date, more up-to-date picture, 1907, where you can see the chimneys are really kind of billowing out the smoke, which is from domestic chimneys, which of course, you know, was causing a lot of the pollution. Next. An even more up-to-date one. This was, I think, done in 2008 by a contemporary artist, Jacqueline Moreau. I think it's obvious. It's the idea that the fog is actually killing you. Next. And here, women in danger. You know, women were vulnerable in a fog, and I have to say, these women are under the care of these men. They don't look desperately kind of as if they're going to look after them, and who is that looming figure through the fog? Next. But many women found love in the fog. There were many short stories about women who obviously couldn't meet their lovers in a living room or whatever because it was forbidden. And so they would go out to meet their lovers in a foggy park, and he would create a little private living room for them. Carry on. And there they are, walking through the fog. In fact, just to tell you, spoiler, she is in fact a princess from a German state, and he's just an ordinary bloke, so it's never going to happen. Next. Yeah, this is the opening page of Dickens' Bleak House. I think we all know it. Fog everywhere, fog up the hill. Next. And here we have the Old Curiosity Shop, and I will finish here, but because it's a literature festival, I think it's useful to understand that Dickens really understood the fog of London. He understood the natural fog as well as the kind of London particular, the dirty fog. And in the Old Curiosity Shop, he uses it very precisely. So it's the natural fog that kills Quilp, who's forever smoking, who is in fact a signifier of industrialisation. So Dickens is using it very cleverly there. Next. And next, that's Quilp Lies Dead. Our mutual friend, again, he uses it. Next. Let's go next one, please. And these are the writers, I'll finish here. These are the writers who also use fog, many more. But Sam Selvon, one of the first black writers to be published in London in the 1950s, he talks about the immigrant experience, and in fact, he uses the London fog as a metaphor for racism. I could go on, but thank you.
In the interest of the health of London's tourist industry, I should say, as Christian goes on to explain in her book, there was a Clean Air Act. Things are better, and Arsenal occasionally wins. So just want to make sure no one's being put off coming to London. We've talked about two historic health crises, and Siddharth Singh was going to now tell us about a crisis that's very much ongoing.
Thanks, David. I'll start with thanking JLF and in particular Namita Gokhale for having me here. I think it's a great festival that I've been enjoying from the other side for the past many years, so it's good to be also speaking now. So I'll start with this project that I was working on back in 2013. There were about 30 to 40 researchers who were kind of figuring out how rural India consumed its energy, what kind of cooking fuels were being used, what kind of electricity was being used. At the end of this project, it was a 3-year-long project, 30 to 40 core researchers and a few hundred more who supported the project in various ways. At the end of the whole cycle of 3 years and a lot of money spent, fewer than 30 people ended up actually reading that report. So at that time, it really struck me. I was like, all this effort went into what exactly? And I thought it's very important for researchers and scientists to be able to communicate their ideas to a larger audience. And I mean, we have examples of a Trump and other leaders around the world who don't really appreciate or understand the importance of that scientific evidence. So that's when I kind of realized that it's important to talk about issues that you deal with on a professional basis in a more accessible manner. Now, around the same time, perhaps around 2015, I read a statistic, which was that 1.1 million Indians die every year due to air pollution. And that really struck me. That's a very large number. That implied that more Indians die due to air pollution every week than from all India-Pakistan wars combined since independence, right? So, but we are less likely to, at least back then, very few people were actually talking about it. So I naturally had questions. I was like, where the hell are these people? If 1 million people are dying, then where are they? Why don't we ever read, have death certificates which say that this person died due to air pollution? I had several other questions. For example, the per capita emissions in Europe is far higher, significantly higher than the per capita emissions in India. So why is it then that air quality is significantly worse in India compared to Europe? This and several other questions made me, want to read more about the issue, and I went on Amazon and I looked up books on air pollution and I found none. And I was frustrated. I was like, somebody should write a book on air pollution. And it took me a while to realize that person is going to be me. Since I had access to researchers and scientific papers through my day job, I kind of I put it together all of this, and the Great Smog of India is basically, and at least the hope is that it's an accessible book which explains the science behind the problem and the economic thinking behind the solutions in a manner that everyone can read and understand. So I'll quickly go through what I think is the reason why we should be taking this very seriously. Just last year, at the peak of the smog, the health minister of the country, went out and said that we should not worry about air pollution. It's not a problem. No one's dying. There's no issue. Don't panic. So that was his message. And one of the key messages that I have in my book is that we must panic. We must panic, and we must start panicking starting yesterday. It's aside from the 1.1 million people who die, there are millions more, perhaps hundreds of millions more, who suffer through chronic issues and other issues that hamper their productivity, the way they live their lives, the way they're able to enjoy the outdoors, the way they're able to interact with their loved ones. In fact, the starting chapter of my book, since you had a slide called Love in the Time of the Fog, the starting chapter of my book is called Love in the Time of Air Pollution. So it refers to the same kind of narratives within India, how families are dealing with the issue. I try to figure out who these people are who are actually suffering. So, try to reach out to people and understand what kind of difficulties they face. So aside from this, aside from the obvious health impact, air pollution is also impacting the economy. As people become less productive, they take more days off work, you'll obviously see some impact on India's growth story. This is made worse to the fact that a lot of families have to deal with bankruptcies due to the healthcare costs. So if somebody in your family has a chronic ailment, perhaps lung cancer, it can really impact the way your finances are and whether you can rise above poverty. In fact, one bureaucrat told me that many of the people that the government has been able to get out of poverty, they've fallen back behind the poverty line because of air pollution. But this has not been quantified so far. Hopefully, researchers over the next 5 or 10 years will be able to do so. Aside from the environmental impact, it's the scale of the problem that is quite surprising. I was in Pakistan last month, and we went to, so I was in Islamabad, we are also talking about air pollution. They are at least 10 years behind India in terms of the conversations that we are having, in terms of the instruments that exist to measure the problem in Pakistan. But the air quality in Islamabad on the day that I was there was worse than anything I've seen in New Delhi. But there's no conversation happening there. Satellite images show that the issues is, it goes from Pakistan all the way to West Bengal. But we think it's a Delhi problem because that's where, I guess, the English language media is. That's where people from, social media kind of talk about the issue. So, aside from these impacts, there's also impact on on agricultural productivity, because there's a lot of aerosol content and particulate matter content in the lower atmosphere. We are seeing significant drops in agricultural productivity in the country. So in a way, it's linked because farmers, about 25 lakh farmers, 2.5 million farmers, end up burning the rice residue. And that causes the problem, but then that also impacts their own productivity, in the longer run. The scale of the problem also goes to, I guess, the various sectors of the economy. In the case of the London smog, it was primarily caused by the use of coal. That was the main fuel that was not properly treated. Therefore, coal for heating, coal for other, aspects of the economy led to the London smog. In India's case, in Delhi's case, there's no one major cause. It really depends on the time of the year. It depends on various aspects. Transport, industry, energy production, construction, agriculture, depending on the time of the year, they all play and they all have a very important role to play. Therefore, the solutions in the case of India are also that much harder. If there was a low-hanging fruit, if there's one thing that could be done, we would have done it by now. But the problem is that it's an issue that spans so many different sectors of the economy, different ministries, different states, that what we really need to deal with this issue is sort of a Paris Agreement, but for air pollution within India, because there are so many stakeholders that are involved. And I think I'll leave it at that, and we can perhaps discuss solutions at some point.
Thank you very much for that. So 3 very distinctive pieces of research, 2 historical, 1 contemporary, but all about health, all about crisis. Can I ask you, Laura, how did the authorities react? What were the options put on the table of those trying to make sense of what was happening in 1918, 1919?
Well, it has to be said that the short answer is that the response was very inadequate. Influenza, as everybody knows, is a viral disease, but virus was a relatively new concept in 1918, and almost every doctor in the world thought they were dealing with a bacterial disease. Of course, antibiotics had not been invented then. So they had, one of the main things that means is that there was no reliable diagnostic test for this disease. And when that second wave struck that I talked about in the Northern Hemisphere autumn of 1918, it was a very, very vicious, unusual form of flu. And so many people thought that it wasn't flu. They thought they were dealing with anything from pneumonic plague to cholera, because this flu gave you a bluish tinge to your face, an effect that doctors dubbed heliotrope cyanosis. And that's also an effect of cholera. So it attracted all these very different names. They also had no treatments. Almost nothing. The only thing they had that worked in any way at all was the so-called wonder drug, aspirin, which could reduce inflammation and fever. But so you see a proliferation of folk cures. You see people eventually turning to religion. This was a very different psychological universe. Darwin, germ theory were relatively recent. So I think it was much easier for people to tip back into a more mystical response to such a threat to the population's health. But then there are some public health measures which are as old almost as time, or at least as old as the first human communities. So we call them collectively social distancing, just separating essentially the sick from the healthy, whether you do that by quarantine or isolation or other ways. Those were put in place, and where they were properly policed, sometimes that worked. But no, overall you'd have to say that the response was underpowered, and that's an underestimate.
And in all three of the issues we're discussing here today, there's an issue of naming. Why is it the Spanish flu?
Very good question. So about the only certainty we have about this pandemic was that it wasn't Spanish. It didn't start in Spain. In 2018, we don't actually know where it started. There are three leading theories that correspond to origins in China, in the US, and in France at a British Army base. But we don't know, and I think that the reason it was called Spanish was because Spain was neutral in the war, and so didn't censor its press. So when the first cases erupted there in the late spring of 1918, they were reported upon by the Spanish newspapers, whereas in the belligerent countries, the US, France, and Britain, which had had it for much longer already, you didn't see that written up in the newspapers, so supposedly so as not to lower the morale of the populations. And so everybody, including the Spaniards, thought that it was rippling out from Madrid. But I think there is a human tendency always to point the finger at the other. The WHO in 2015 issued a set of guidelines for naming diseases to try and avoid that kind of stigmatization, because it has knock-on economic and social effects which can be very long-lasting and very damaging. But unfortunately, I think it's a strong human urge to want to do that, and it's not necessarily going to be a doctor who names the next pandemic, maybe a journalist, maybe a politician, maybe the first person to realize something is happening. And they may not know anything about the WHO guidelines, and names have a habit, as you know, of sticking.
And there's a similar story with the London smog, a desire to find a name for this thing.
Yeah, and it was actually rather a problem for would-be legislators, because there was a huge kind of attempt from the early 19th century to get rid of the London air pollution, the London fog. But of course, it was given these very romantic names: London particular, London ivy, pea super. Smog comes in as a word in 1904 by a Dutch chemist who said, let's get rid of all these kind of rather fancy names, let's call it smog, smoke, fog. But it never took off. People, Londoners, said, we know what we're talking about, we don't want another word. And there was a kind of flip side to fog, which is a positive side for Londoners. They were quite proud of it. I mean, they knew it killed, but, you know, think about it. If you've actually got smoke belching from an industrial chimney, you've got jobs. If you've got smoke belching from a domestic chimney, it means you can afford coal. So, you know, there is a kind of positive side to it, which we really shouldn't ignore. And it's only until cheaper alternatives come in that you can actually kind of get rid of it. And as I say, legislators started from the early 19th century desperately trying to push through these Clean Air Acts. They were watered down by vested interests, first of all from industrialists who wouldn't accept them. And when the industrialists said, yes, well, we'll clean up our act, then, of course, you had more domestic housing, and governments are very reluctant to interfere in how people live their lives. And so it wasn't until, and I'm glad you made that point, it wasn't until 1956, after the Great Smog of 52, that the Clean Air Act came in. And actually, it was very touch and go whether it was going to actually pass. In the end it did, and amazingly the last smog of 1962, the very last one, actually showed how quickly the different councils in London worked to clean up their own areas. In fact, there was a kind of race between the councils. The city had already won it because the city was a special area in London anyway, but councils really raced to be the first to be completely clean in their air.
Thank you. Is India facing a similar difficult choice, the choice between quality of air and progress and development and industry? Is that the heart of this, that there's a dilemma, a choice to be made?
Absolutely, you're spot on in the analysis. It is at the heart of the issue. It's a developmental crisis at its core. To give you a very small example, back in 2000, in the year 2000, the Supreme Court ordered that certain high polluting industries that were located within the confines of the city of Delhi, and in particular within residential areas of Delhi, that they were ordered to move out and away, several hundred kilometers away from the city center. Naturally, and the reason for this was because it was literally polluting, and even back then they realized that it's impacting the health of the citizens. This led to riots, multiple people died, buses were set on fire, and these were all the workers within these industries that were doing that. This obviously was a bloody juncture in India's history of fighting air pollution, but we see this in more benign ways happening at all times in various constituencies around the country. You cannot possibly go up to a politician and tell them that this particular industry is polluting, so we need to shut it down, because that constituency would have, say 10,000 voters, and then you have, 1,000 good jobs in that one particular industrial unit. And it's difficult to kind of deal with that. In fact, in my book, The Great Smog of India, I have very controversially stated that we must not ignore the interests of the polluters. And I don't mean it in a way that we must, encourage it, but in the sense that we need to address the challenges that they will face in case you were to shut it down. There's several examples of this. For example, indoor air pollution is a major issue in the country, and it's primarily caused because in rural India, women use biomass to cook. And it's also an inequality issue, because women suffer more than men, due to this indoor air pollution. But if you were to take action against this, by stopping it from happening, you will also have to provide an alternative that is just as cheap. In this case, say LPG. The government has tried to subsidize it, but it's still not cheap enough. So for most families, they would, even after having an LPG cylinder, they would still continue to use biomass at home. Another example would be the railway sector itself. The whole railway sector in the country, passenger rail is cross-subsidized by the transport of coal. So if you were to stop coal, in the country, it would also imply that rail fares will increase. So how do you deal with that kind of an impact for passengers? So these are the kind of choices that we face, that we must address.
We're sitting here in one of the world's literary superpowers. Are we seeing anything similar that we saw in London, of art and literature taking on this subject of air pollution and the great smog of India?
I don't think so.
The great smog novel is yet to be written.
I think it's yet to be written. In fact, I think Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, kind of referred to this a couple of years ago, where he talked about literature not reflecting what's actually happening. And I think that's generally true in India's case. I have not seen works of art which kind of talk about the gravity of the problem. But I think the first step is to communicate the gravity of this problem, which is what I hopefully try to do.
Has there been a great flu pandemic novel?
Well, I think that's really interesting, because I think that when for something, an event or a phenomenon as the fog or the smog, to kind of penetrate popular consciousness, it has to penetrate art first, and you have to create some kind of cultural, psychological monument to it. Otherwise, it just doesn't anchor itself in our memories. The flu did not, and there are reasons for that. One of which I could mention is that we had no idea that it had killed so many people until basically the end of the 20th century, when the data were gathered and analysed properly. For most of the 20th century, we thought it was a disaster on the same scale, roughly, as the First World War. It didn't penetrate art. The great writers of the time, for example, the four emerging American writers, Hemingway, Dos Passos, Fitzgerald, and the poet Williams, forgotten his name, they did not mention it, yet they lived through it. All of them were affected by it. And I think that has to do with overlapping with the war, that has to do with not having the vocabulary of that particular disease, all sorts of reasons. But interestingly, it's now beginning to penetrate, 100 years later. You're seeing novels emerge that take Spanish flu as a theme. And I think that's because we know now what we're dealing with. We have the numbers, we have the vocabulary, and we have a lot of the stories as well that can be turned into fiction. So it's kind of, I see it as a work in progress.
And is that one of the reasons why it remains so under the shadow of the First World War, a conflict that produced an enormous body of art and literature and poetry.
Absolutely. I think it has to do with storytelling as well. You know, what are the events that lend themselves to storytelling? They're ones with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and with heroes and villains. Psychologists have shown this in studies. These are the things, these are the events which go down easily in our memories. A flu pandemic, particularly that flu pandemic, it doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and end. It's everywhere, all at once. One of my difficulties in writing this book was trying to pull a narrative thread out of it. And who are the heroes and who are the villains? There are none. Okay, you could point to some doctors, but essentially there's one big villain, and he's not human, or it's not human. So it's really difficult to tell a story. War lends itself beautifully to storytelling, and we also, I think, there's an issue with glorifying war, glorifying mass death in the form of war, which we don't do for other kinds of mass death. Yeah, so there's a storytelling disadvantage, if you like, and there always will be, unfortunately.
Thank you, thank you. It's now time, we've got about 15 minutes left for questions. Do we have, I think we have roaming mics. We have 3 incredible stories to discuss. Who would like to ask a question? Gentleman at the front.
My question was that, isn't Robin Cook written about this? Sorry? Hasn't Robin Cook written about the flu or things like that, pandemics? Robin Cook.
Robin Cook? I don't think Robin Cook has written about the flu, as far as I know.
Should do, clearly. The lady beside you.
My question's for Laura. You mentioned that you were talking about the lack of art produced about the Spanish flu. And I wondered how much the loss of life during the First World War, where you had people in their 20s who would presumably have been at their peak of art production, who lost their lives as soldiers. And as you mentioned about, I believe it was the Austrian artist who lost his life 3 days after his wife, leaving behind a small painting of their family. How much the loss of life of the age group that would otherwise have been producing art caused the lack of art that resulted from the flu?
I think that's demonstrably not true, because we have plenty of art about the war, which wiped out lots of people of that age group, so there you go. You know, why the distinction?
You think it's more to do with the nature of what makes a story, what makes a story attractive to us as...
And the facts weren't available. And also perhaps, you know, it was T.S. Eliot who said that humankind cannot stand very much misery, and maybe paraphrasing. You know, it was just one extra trauma on top of 4 exhausting years of war. People didn't want to talk about it.
One of the most striking scenes when you look at the film at the end of the film reels of the end of the war is people celebrating with masks on. Because if you were putting your safety first, you wouldn't be out in big crowds. But the urge to celebrate seemed to overcome that.
So I opened my book with the story of the funeral of the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, because I think it captures that paradox perfectly. So you have the funeral procession of Apollinaire going down through the streets of Paris towards Père Lachaise, and it can't move because it's coming up against the joyful armistice crowds. Everybody's drunk, everybody's dancing and kissing and waving their crutches and their flags about. And that's exactly what happened to the memory of the flu somehow, even though it killed so many more people.
Thank you. More questions? There's 2 at the back there. Can we go now? Thank you.
Siddharth, I have a question for you. So you shared one of your dilemmas before writing to the book was that Europe...
Could you hold the mic closer to your mouth, please?
My question is that you shared that Europe is having more emissions than India, and yet we have a lower quality of air. So can you throw some light on why that's so?
Yeah. So there are several reasons for that. To begin with, even though emissions are higher, what are we talking about when we talk about emissions? We're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, right? This is from the combustion of fuels, particularly natural gas, which is primarily used for heating and so on. Natural gas and the other fuels that are used in Europe generally burn more cleanly. It has lesser content of black carbon or soot, as we call it. So that is number one. Number two, the technologies that are being used also lead to more clean burning. That's number 2. But I think the most important reason is the nature of India's or northern India's geographic and meteorological realities, which in the book I call it the meteorological misfortune. So in northern India in particular, in the winter time, the wind speeds become 1/3 of what they are in the rest of the year. So slow wind speeds, as temperatures drop, particulate matter tends to settle down. And there's no way for it to evacuate because there's the mountain range up north, and it almost creates this bowl where all this particulate matter, which is otherwise being generated through transport and what have you, all of it just kind of stays there, and there's no easy way for it to go away. And that changes in the summers when the winds pick up and the temperatures rise, so the particulate matter can rise into the air, and so it's a lot of these geographical and meteorological realities which have a role. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question there, if we can get a mic to that lady.
So my question is to you. So last to last year, the Supreme Court made a judgment that no firecrackers during Diwali, because for obvious reasons, the air quality is going to get horrible. And yet there was a sense of pride that the people of Delhi were showing in breaking that law that had been set down. So my question is, what would it take for people to just understand the gravity of the situation? Because you've been working on this for a while. So from a people perspective, what would it take?
So you're absolutely right. In fact, it shocked me. There was this politician, Tejinder Pal Bagga, who announced that he's going to violate the Supreme Court order. He bought firecrackers from neighboring states and decided to distribute it to children in the poorer parts of the city. So I guess this stems at the heart of the problem, where people don't realize that air pollution is something that impacts everyone, and the impact on the human body is very real. It's not this perceived sense of Hinduism being targeted through such rules. They said that oh, air pollution doesn't come from Diwali, it comes from transport. You guys are driving your SUVs, and other people are burning the rice stubble and so on. So why is this Hindu practice being targeted? Well, the response to that is that all these various industries which are very important to the economy, it's hard to put an end to that. You can't suddenly say that we're going to stop all coal-fired power plants. Then you'd all have power cuts through the day. But firecrackers is such a non-integral aspect of the economy. Even if you did not use firecrackers, it would not really make any impact on the economy. You would still be able to go on with your lives. In fact, you'd probably live a healthier life. But I think that kind of reasoning or that kind of understanding, eludes some people.
Can I ask, Christine, how long did it take London to address its problem with the smog?
Well, I mean, Queen Elizabeth I was complaining about smoke in London, but in fact, if you take it from the early 19th century, I mean, it was 150 years of a long battle, and it was really a fluke that the 56 Clean Air Act went through. But I wanted to kind of add one point, that one of the problems with air pollution is, of course, people don't put on death certificates, he or she died from air pollution. They put other causes, emphysema, flu, or whatever. And, these people probably wouldn't have died if the air had not been polluted. And in fact, we've got a very interesting case going through the UK at the moment of a young girl 13 years old, who was asthmatic, living on probably one of the most polluted roads in Great Britain, the South Circular, and she died. Now, on her death certificate, they put she died from asthma, but in fact, what they're trying to do is get the autopsy redone so that they can put on the death certificate she died from air pollution, and that will be the first time air pollution will be actually mentioned on a death certificate. And I think, if we had more death certificates that said this person's life was cut short by air pollution, then people would take it much more seriously.
And would there be a legislative change at that point? Do you think that would trigger a political response?
Well, I think, in the end, the Clean Air Act went through because the people actually wanted cleaner air, and it has to come from the people. They have to be on side. So I think the main movement towards the Clean Air Act was post-Second World War. There was a huge smog in 1948, another one in 1952. People had fought a war, they'd lived through blackouts. They no longer wanted to live in a kind of city that was black for many months of the year, where you could not see your hand in front of your face. So in fact, this caused people to start protesting against it, and many of the kind of tabloid newspapers would have poison on their front newspapers, and this kind of pushed it through, where people accepted that things had to change. But, you know, just as people are now in love with their cars, and it's not my car that causes pollution, it's your car. That's the way we all think. It was the same with the coal fire. People love their coal fire. They did not want to lose it. But in the end, there have to be cleaner alternatives, and we all have to take responsibility for it.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes. So if we're quick and efficient, we can get some more questions in. Lady at the front, please.
Hello, my question is for Siddharth.
Could you hold the mic closer to your mouth, please?
Hello, my question is for Siddharth, sir. So you talked about the factors of air pollution and the sufferings, but I want to know the solution. According to you, what can be done to handle it in a best way?
Briefly, please.
Okay, so I'll have to be very brief. The solution, the problem is that there is no one factor that is contributing to air pollution. Therefore, the solution will need to span all the various sectors of the economy. The one thing that I would say that what we really need is a political push that can take forward action at all these various levels. For this reason, I think, you know, the idea of Clean India, there's a Swachh Bharat mission. Swachh Bharat translates to Clean India. It's a mission that is primarily dealing with the sanitation issues, you know, cleaning the roads, ensuring toilets are made. I think the idea of this Clean India or Swachh Bharat should expand to include clean water, to include clean air. Only when you take a holistic view across all sectors can you possibly make change.
Thank you very much. Further questions, please. Yes, over there, please. Second row.
Well, hi, I have a question. So you mentioned there was an artist during the Spanish flu, and the family died, and he saw the wife, you know, getting this epidemic. So my question is that how it actually traveled across the different points of time during the first wave and second wave, because as you said, second wave was lethal in the northern hemisphere. So when you say that, how did that travel to one country to another? Like, what is the chain reaction to it? Because it has to spread in a certain way, right? There has to be a sort of a some sort of a route, you know.
So you mean how does it spread between the three waves?
Because how did the family got the epidemic?
Okay, well, flu is a respiratory disease, so it spreads on the breath and coughs and sneezes. It's highly contagious. So that's how it spreads physically. The wave structure of the pandemic, that's the structure of every flu pandemic, and it's really interesting, and we don't really understand it. There's often this herald wave, they call it, which is a mild wave, which kind of lulls everybody into a false sense of security, and then it goes away, and then they're whacked by this second wave. Which is very lethal and spreads very rapidly. It has to do with the evolution of the flu virus. The flu virus is very labile, so it changes very rapidly. That's why we have to update our vaccine every year. But the idea is that a new flu strain emerges, and it has to adapt, go through many rounds of reproduction and adapt to become contagious between people. So the new virus emerges. It originally is not terribly contagious, and then it acquires new modifications, probably in that lull after the first wave, and then it bursts out, very, very dangerous and very, very contagious.
Did the mobility of 1918-19,
yes,
armies demobilizing in 1980, armies rushing to the west?
So I think this is really interesting. So we've had 5 flu pandemics since the 1890s. None of them killed more than 2 million people apart from 1918, which, as I said, killed at least 25 times as many. So why is that? We have to explain that anomaly. And one of the theories is that there was a kind of synergy between the war and the virus. One of the ways that worked was through dissemination. A lot of people were just on the move, both troops and civilians as displaced persons. And so they helped spread it around. But there's also an idea that that synergy helped create a particularly virulent virus, and that has to do with evolutionary reasons that I could explain, but would take time. If anybody's interested, I'll tell them afterwards.
We've got about 90 seconds for a really quick question and a really quick response. Lady was very quick. Exactly what we needed. Lady in the yellow, please. Thank you.
Just to add on to your last point, Laura, did the fact that immunity was probably low post the war also help create the pandemic, and how big it was?
Great question. Were people weakened by the war?
Were people weakened by the war? Well, the first thing to be said is that every flu pandemic is caused by the emergence of a novel strain. So essentially, by definition, everybody is naive immunologically to that strain, though they may have had exposure to related strains. That explains some of the variability and mortality across the globe. Were they weakened by the war? Yes, that feeds into this evolutionary explanation that I referred to. So a lot of people were very hungry at that time, and if you're hungry, your immune system is compromised slightly. There's also an idea that when the virus reached the trenches of the Western Front, it encountered a lot of young men who were, many of whom had been gassed, so their lungs were weakened already, and therefore more vulnerable to a respiratory pathogen. They were also essentially immobile. We don't think about this, but those young men, assuming they survived long enough to catch the flu, before they went over the top, so to speak, they were packed into these trenches like sardines, and they weren't going anywhere. Well, one of the ideas about the flu virus is that over time it moderates its virulence in order to keep its host alive, because it's in its evolutionary interest to keep the host alive so it can spread it around more. But those young men were not spreading it anywhere because they were immobile. So the virus maintained its very high levels of virulence, and that's one of the thoughts as to why it was so exceptionally lethal in 1918.
Thank you very much. That, I'm afraid, is all we have time for. Would you please join me in thanking our panelists, Siddharth Singh,
thank you all,
Laura Spinney, and Christine Courtin. Thank you very much.
We wish to thank our panelists, Christine Courtin, Laura Spinney, Siddharth Singh, David Olusoga. Thank you so much. The authors would be signing their books at the book signing area next to Darbar Hall. Next session begins